Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 10, Auguste Frédéric Louis VIESSE de Marmont, Marshal, Duke of Ragusa.
Auguste Frédéric Louis VIESSE de Marmont, the youngest of Napoleon's marshals, was born at Châtillon-sur-Seine on July 25, 1774. The family of VIESSE belonged to the smaller nobility, who from the days of Richelieu had supplied the officers of the line for the old royal army. Marmont's father had destined him from the cradle for the military career, and had devoted his life to training him, both in body and mind, for the profession of arms. His hours of patience and self-denial were not thrown away, for, thanks to his early Spartan training, the Duke of Ragusa seldom knew fatigue or sickness, and owing to this physical strength was able, without neglecting his professional duties, to spend hours on scientific and literary work. In 1792, young Marmont, at the age of 18, passed the entrance examination for the artillery school at Châlons, and started his military career with his father's oft-repeated words ringing in his ears. Merit without success is infinitely better than success without merit, but determination and merit always command success. The young artillery cadet had both determination and capacity, and his early career foreshadowed his future success. Aristocratic to the bone, Marmont detested the excesses of the Revolution, but politics during his early years had little effect on his thoughts, which were solely fixed on military glory. The exigencies of the Revolutionary Wars cut short his student days at Châlons, and before the end of 1792, he was gazetted to the 1st Artillery Regiment. In February 1793, he saw his first active service with the Army of the Alps under General Kellerman. Owing to the dearth of trained officers, though only newly gazetted, he performed all the duties of a senior colonel, laying out entrenched camps and commanding the artillery of the division to which he was attached. It was with this promising record already behind him that he attracted Bonaparte's attention at the siege of Toulon by his admirable handling of the guns under his command, and by his inventive powers, which overcame all obstacles. From that day, the Corsican destined him for his service, and during the campaign in the Maritime Alps, used him as an unofficial aide-de-camp. So devoted did Marmont become to the future emperor, that when Bonaparte was arrested at the time of Robespierre's fall, he and Junot formed a plan of rescuing their idol by killing the sentries and carrying him off by sea. When Bonaparte returned to Paris, Marmont accompanied him and was offered the post of superintendent of the gun factory at Moulins. He contemptuously refused this position, telling the inspector of ordnance that he would not mind such a post in peacetime, but that he was going to see as much active service as he could while the war lasted. So, at his own request, he was posted to the army of Pichegru, which was besieging Mainz. A temporary suspension of hostilities on the Rhine gave him the opportunity of once again joining his chosen leader. And early in 1796, he started for Italy on Bonaparte's staff. Lodi was one of the great days of his life. Early in the action, he captured one of the enemy's batteries, but a moment later, he was thrown from his horse and ridden over by the whole of the cavalry, without, however, receiving a single scratch. Scarcely had he mounted when he was dispatched along the river, under fire of the whole Austrian force on the other bank, to carry orders to the commander of the cavalry, who was engaged in fording the river higher up. Of his escort of 5, 2 were killed, while his horse was severely wounded, yet he managed to return in time to take his place among the band of heroes who forced the long bridge in the face of a storm of bullets and grape. Castiglione added to his laurels, for it was his handling of the artillery that enabled Augereau to win his great victory. The Marshal, in his memoirs, asserts that this short campaign was the severest strain he ever underwent. I never at any other time endured such fatigue as during the 8 days of that campaign. Always on horseback, on reconnaissance, or fighting, I was, I believe, 5 days without sleep, save for a few stolen minutes. After the final battle, the General-in-Chief gave me leave to rest, and I took full advantage of it. I ate, I lay down, and I slept 24 hours at a stretch. And thanks to youth, hardiness, a good constitution, and the restorative powers of sleep, I was as fresh again as at the beginning of the campaign. Though Castiglione thus brought him fresh honors, it nearly caused an estrangement between him and his chief. For Bonaparte, ever with an eye to the future, desiring to gain as many friends as possible, chose one of Berthier's staff officers to take the news of the victory to Paris. This was a bitter blow to his ambitious aide-de-camp, whose pride was further piqued because his hero, forgetting that he had not to deal with one of the ordinary adventurers who formed so large a number of the officers of the army of Italy, with great want of tact, had offered him opportunities of adding to his wealth by perquisites and commissions, abhorrent to the eyes of a descendant of an honorable family. But the exigencies of war and the thirst for glory left little time for brooding, and Bonaparte, recognizing with whom he had to deal, took the opportunity of the successful fighting which penned Wurmser into Mantua to send Marmont with dispatches to Paris. As his reward, the Minister of War promoted him colonel and commandant of the 2nd Regiment of Horse Artillery. A curious state of affairs arose from this appointment, for promotion in the artillery ran quite independent of ordinary army rank. Accordingly, the army list ran as follows: Bonaparte, lieutenant colonel of a battalion of artillery, seconded as general-in-chief of the Army of Italy. Marmont, colonel of the 2nd Regiment Horse Artillery, seconded as aide-de-camp to Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, the commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy. Marmont hurried back to Italy in time to join Bonaparte's staff an hour before the Battle of Arcola. The Austrians were making their last effort to relieve the fortress of Mantua, and it seemed as if they would be successful, as Alvinzi had concentrated 40,000 troops against 26,000. The French attempted a surprise, but were discovered, and for 3 days the fate of the campaign hung on the stubborn fight in the marshes of Arcola. It was Marmont who helped to extricate Bonaparte when he was flung off the embankment into the ditch, a service which Bonaparte never forgot. Diplomatic missions to Venice and the Vatican slightly turned the young soldier's head, and his chief had soon to give him a severe reprimand for loitering among Josephine's beauties at Milan instead of hastening back to headquarters. But to a man of Marmont's character, one word of warning was enough. His head governed his heart. Glory was his lodestar. Ambitious though he was essentially a man of honor and fine feelings, and refused the hand of Pauline Bonaparte for the simple reason that he did not truly love her. A year later, he made a love match with Mademoiselle Perregaux, but differences of temperament and the long separation which his military career imposed caused the marriage to turn out unhappily, and this lack of domestic felicity spoiled the marshal's life and nearly embittered his whole character, turning him for the time into a self-centered man with an eye solely to his own glory and a sharp tongue which did not spare even his own friends. Yet in his early days, Marmont was a bright and cheerful companion, and no one enjoyed more a practical joke, getting up sham duels between cowards or sending bogus instructions to officious commanders. But fond as he was of amusement, even during his early career, he could find delight in the society of men of science and learning like Monge and Berthollet. After the Peace of Campo Formio, he accompanied his chief to Paris, where an incident occurred which illustrates well the character of the two men. The Minister of War wanted detailed information regarding the English preparations against invasion, and Bonaparte offered to send his aide-de-camp as a spy. Marmont indignantly refused to go in such a capacity, and a permanent estrangement nearly took place. Their standards had nothing in common. In the one, honor could conquer ambition; in the other, ambition knew no rules of honor. However, their lust for glory brought them together again, and Marmont sailed with the Egyptian expedition. He was dispatched north to command Alexandria after the Battle of the Pyramids, where his guns had played so important a part in shattering the Mamelukes. Later, he was entrusted with the control of the whole of the Mediterranean littoral. His task was a difficult one, but a most useful training for a young commander. With a tiny garrison, he had to hold the important town of Alexandria and to keep in order a large province, to organize small columns to repress local risings, to make his own arrangements for raising money to pay his troops, and consequently to reorganize the fiscal system of the country, to reconstruct canals and to improvise flotillas of barges to supply Alexandria with provisions, to keep in touch with the remnant of the French fleet and thus to try to establish communications with Europe. He was responsible for resisting any attempt at invasion by the Turks or the English. And it was mainly owing to his measures that when the former landed at Aboukir, they were destroyed before they could march inland. While his comrades were gaining military glory in Syria, he was fighting the plague at Alexandria. Learning that patient attention to detail and careful supervision of the health of his troops were as important attributes of a commander as dash and courage in the field. Marmont quitted Egypt with joy. He had learned many useful lessons, but like the rest of the army, he hated the country and the half-Oriental life. And above all, as he said, seeing a campaign and not taking part in it was a horrible punishment. On returning to Paris, his time was fully occupied in winning over the artillery to Bonaparte. He had no false ideas on the subject, for as he said to Junot before the Egyptian expedition, "You will see, my friend, that on his return Bonaparte will seize the crown." As his reward, the first consul gave him the choice of the command of the artillery of the guard or a seat as Councillor of State. Jealous of lands and flattered by the title, he chose the councillorship, in which capacity he was employed on the War Committee and entrusted with the reorganization of the artillery. His first business was to provide a proper train to ensure the quick and easy mobilization of the artillery. After the Marengo campaign, he took in hand the reform of the matériel. Too many different types of guns existed. Marmont reorganized both the field and the fortress artillery, replacing the 7 old types of guns by 3. Namely 6-pounders, 12-pounders, and 24-pounders. He also reduced the different types of wheels for gun carriages, limbers, and wagons from 24 to 8, thus greatly simplifying the provision of ammunition and the work of repair in the field. The Marengo campaign added to his prestige as an artillery officer. It was owing to his ingenuity that the guns were unmounted and pulled by hand in cradles up the steep side of the mountain and thus safely taken over the St. Bernard Pass. It was his ingenious brain which suggested the paving of the road with straw, whereby the much-needed artillery was forwarded to Lannes by night, without any casualties, right under the batteries of the fortress of Bard. It was owing to his foresight that the reserve battery of guns, captured from the enemy, saved the day at Marengo by containing the Austrians, while Dessaix's fresh troops were being deployed. And it was the tremendous effect of his massed battery which gave Kellerman the opportunity for his celebrated charge. The first consul marked his approval by promoting Marmont a general of division, and thus, at the age of 26, the young artillery officer had nearly reached the head of his profession. After Marengo, he continued his work of reorganization, but before the end of the year he was once again in Italy, this time as a divisional commander under Brune, who, being no great strategist, was glad to avail himself of the brains of the first consul's favorite. It was thanks to Marmont's plans that the French army successfully crossed the Mincio in the face of the enemy and forced on him the armistice of Treviso. When Moreau's victory of Hohenlinden induced Austria to make peace, the general was sent to reorganize the Italian artillery on the same principles he had laid down for the French. He established an immense foundry and arsenal at Pavia, and the excellence of his plans was clearly proved in many a later campaign. From Italy, he was recalled to Paris in September 1802 as Inspector General of Artillery. He threw himself heart and soul into his new duties, but found time to increase his scientific knowledge and to keep himself up to date with everything in the political and scientific world. He keenly supported Fulton's invention of the steamboat and pressed it on the first consul, and to the day of his death, he was convinced that if the emperor had adopted the invention, the invasion of England would have been successful. The year 1804 brought him the delight of his first important command. In February, he was appointed Chief of the Corps of the Army of the Ocean, which was stationed in Holland. He entered on his task with his usual fervor. His first step was to make friends with all the Dutch officials, and thus to secure the smooth working of his commissariat and supply departments. Then he turned to the actual training of his troops. For this purpose, he obtained permission to hold a big camp of instruction where all the divisions of his corps were massed. So successful was this experiment that it became an annual institution. But amid all the pleasure of this congenial work came the bitter moment when he found the name of so mediocre a soldier as BERTHIER included in the list of the new marshals and his own omitted. It was a sore blow, and his appointment as Colonel General of the Horse Chasseurs and Grand Eagle of the Legion of Honor did little to mitigate it. The emperor, careful as ever to stimulate devotion, later explained to him that a dashing officer like himself would have plenty of opportunities of gaining distinction, while this was Béchir's only chance. But in spite of this, the neglect rankled, and from that day he was no longer the blindly devoted follower of Napoleon. On the outbreak of the Austrian War, Marmont's corps became the Second Corps of the Grand Army. In the operations ending in Ulm, the Second Corps formed part of the left wing. After the capitulation, it was detached to cover the French communications from an attack from the direction of Styria. In the summer of the following year, Marmont was dispatched as commander-in-chief to Dalmatia, where he spent the next 5 years of his life. Dalmatia had been ceded to France by the Treaty of Pressburg. In Napoleon's eyes, the importance of the province lay in the harbor of Cattaro, which he regarded as an outlet to the Balkan Peninsula. His intention was to get possession of Montenegro, to come to an understanding with Ali Pacha of Janina and the Sultan, and oppose the policy of Russia. But the Russians and Montenegrins had seized Cattaro and were threatening to besiege Ragusa. It was to meet this situation that the emperor in July 1806 hastily sent his former favorite to Dalmatia. The new commander-in-chief found himself, as in Egypt, faced with the difficulty of supply. Half the army was in hospital from want of proper nourishment and common-sense sanitation. Having, by his care of his men, refilled his battalions, he advanced boldly on the enemy and drove them out of their positions. This punishment kept the Montenegrins quiet for the future, and the Russians fell back on Cattaro. From there, he was unable to drive them owing to the guns of their fleet. And it was not till the Treaty of Tilsit that the French got possession of the coveted port. The French commander's chief difficulty in administering his province was that which is felt in all uncivilized countries, the difficulty of holding down a hostile population where roads do not exist. Otherwise, his just but stern rule admirably suited the townsmen of the little cities on the coast, while order was kept among the hill tribes by making their headmen responsible for their behavior and by aiding them in attacking the Turks, who had seized certain tracts of territory and maltreated the inhabitants. But it was not gratitude which kept the hillmen quiet, so much as the miles of new roads on which the French commander employed his army when not engaged on expeditions against restless marauders. During his years in the Dalmatian provinces, Marmont constructed more than 200 miles of roads, with the result that his small force was able with ease to hold down the long, narrow, mountainous province by the speed with which he could mobilize his punitive expeditions. Moreover, owing to the increased means of traffic, the peasants were able to find a market for their goods, and the prosperity of the country increased beyond belief. With prosperity came contentment. Manufactures were established, and the mines and the other natural resources of the country were exploited to advantage. As the Emperor of Austria said to Metternich in 1817, when visiting the province, "It is a great pity that Marshal Marmont was not 2 or 3 years longer in Dalmatia." The years spent at Ragusa were probably the happiest of Marmont's life. His successful work was recognized in 1808, when the Emperor created him Duke of Ragusa. Each day was full of interest. He was head of the civil administration and of the judicial and fiscal departments. As commander-in-chief, he was responsible for the health, welfare, and discipline of the troops, and for the military works which were being erected to protect the province from Austrian aggression. He had his special hobby, the roads. Yet in spite of all this business, he found time to put himself in the hands of a tutor and to work 10 hours a day at history, chemistry, and anatomy. To aid him in his studies, he collected a traveling library of 600 volumes, which accompanied him in all his later campaigns. The Austrian campaign of 1809 called him from these congenial labors to the even more congenial operations of war. The duty of the army of Dalmatia was to attempt to cut off the Archduke John on his retirement from Italy, but the Duke of Ragusa had not sufficient troops to carry out this operation successfully, although he effected a junction with the army of Italy. After a succession of small engagements, the united armies found themselves on the Danube in time to take part in the Battle of Wagram. In reserve, during the greater part of the battle, Marmont's corps was entrusted with the pursuit of the enemy. Unfortunately, either from lack of appreciation of the situation or from jealousy, their commander refused to allow DAVOUT to cooperate with him, and consequently, although he overtook the Austrians, he was not strong enough to hold them till other divisions of the army came up. However, at the end of the operations, Napoleon created him marshal. But the Duke of Ragusa's joy at receiving this gift was tempered by the way it was given. For the emperor, angry doubtless at the escape of the Austrians, told him, "I have given you your nomination, and I have great pleasure in bestowing on you this proof of my affection. But I am afraid I have incurred the reproach of listening rather to my affection than to your right to this distinction. You have plenty of intelligence, but there are needed for war qualities in which you are still lacking, and which you must work to acquire. Between ourselves, you have not yet done enough to justify entirely my choice. At the same time, I am confident that I shall have reason to congratulate myself on having nominated you, and that you will justify me in the eyes of the army." Unkind critics of the three new marshals created after Wagram said that Napoleon, having lost lands, wanted to get the small change for him. But it is only fair to remember that though MacDonald, Marmont, and Oudinot were all inferior to lands, they were quite as good soldiers as some of the original marshals. After peace was declared, the new marshal returned to Dalmatia and took up the threads of his old life. He had won the respect of the inhabitants and the fear of their foes, the Turks, and save for an occasional expedition against the brigands or friction with the fiscal officials, his time passed peaceably and pleasantly. But in 1811 he was recalled to Paris to receive orders before starting on a new sphere of duty. MASSÉNA, the spoiled child of victory, had met his match at Torres Vedras, and Napoleon, blaming the man instead of the system, had determined to try a fresh leader for the army, opposing Sir Arthur Wellesley. The emperor did not hide from himself the fact that in selecting Marmont, he was making an experiment, for he told St. Cyr that he had sent Marmont to Spain because he had plenty of talent, but that he had not yet tested to the full his force of character. And he added, "I shall soon be able to judge of that, for now he is left to his own resources." The new commander of the army of Portugal set out with the full confidence that the task was not beyond his powers, and with the promise of the viceroyalty of one of the 5 provinces into which Spain was to be divided. He arrived at the front 2 days after the Battle of Fuentes Onoro, and found a very different state of affairs from what he had expected. The country was a howling waste covered with fierce guerrillas. The French army, so long accustomed to success, was absolutely demoralized by repeated disappointments and defeats. It was necessary to take stringent measures to restore the morale of the troops before he could call on them to face once more the infantry whose fire was the most murderous of all the armies of Europe. Accordingly, he withdrew from the Portuguese frontier, put his army into cantonments round Salamanca, and set to work on the difficult task of collecting supplies from a country which was already swept bare. Meanwhile, he split up his army into 6 divisions, established direct communications between himself and the divisional officers, and, to get rid of the grumblers, gave leave to all officers who so desired to return to France. At the same time, he distributed his weak battalions among the other corps so that each battalion had a complement of 700 muskets. He also broke up the weak squadrons and batteries and brought up the remainder to serve as strength. Scarcely was this reorganization completed when SOULT, who had been defeated at Albuera, called on Marmont to aid him in saving Badajoz. In spite of his personal dislike for the Duke of Dalmatia, the marshal hurried to his aid, and for the time the important fortress was saved. During the rest of the summer, the army of Portugal lay in the valley of the Tagus, holding the bridge of Almaraz, and thus ready at any moment to go to the relief of Badajoz or Ciudad Rodrigo, the two keys of Portugal. When in the autumn, Wellington threatened Ciudad Rodrigo, the Marshal, calling to his aid d'Orsay, who commanded in northern Spain, at the successful engagement of El Baden, drove back the advance guard of the Anglo-Portuguese and threw a large quantity of provisions into the fortress. The year 1812 was a disastrous one for the French arms all over Europe. The emperor attempted to direct the Spanish War from Paris. In his desire to secure all southern Spain, he stripped Marmont's army to reinforce Suchet in his conquest of Valencia. Accordingly, in January, the Marshal was powerless to stop Wellington's dash at Ciudad Rodrigo and was unable later to make a sufficient demonstration in Portugal to relieve the pressure on Badajoz. So both the fortresses fell, and the Duke of Ragusa was blamed for the emperor's mistake. He was thereafter called upon to try to stem the victorious advance of the English into Spain. Short of men, of horses, and of supplies, he did wonders. Thanks to his strenuous efforts, supplies were massed at Salamanca. Good food and careful nursing emptied the hospitals and filled the ranks, and the cavalry was supplied with remounts by dismounting the field officers of the infantry. The month of July saw an interesting duel round Salamanca between Marmont and Wellington. The two armies were very nearly equal in numbers, the French having 47,000 men and the English 44,000. The French had the advantage of a broad base with lines of retreat either on Burgos or Madrid. The English had to cover their single line of communication, which ran through Ciudad Rodrigo. The French had the further advantage that their infantry marched better than the English. Owing to these causes, their commander was so far able to outgeneral his adversary that by July 22nd, he was actually threatening the English line of retreat. But a tactical mistake threw away all these strategic advantages. In his eagerness, he allowed his leading division to get too extended, forgetting that he was performing the dangerous operation of a flank march. Wellington waited till he saw his opportunity, and then threw himself on the weak French center and cut the French army in half, thus proving his famous dictum that the great general is not he who makes fewest mistakes, but he who can best take advantage of the mistakes of his enemy. Marmont saw his error as soon as the English attack began, but a wound from a cannonball disabled him at the very commencement of the action. This injury to his arm was so serious that he had to throw up his command and return to France, and for the whole of the next year he had to wear his arm in a sling. Napoleon, furious with the Marshal for his ill success, most unjustly blamed him for not waiting for reinforcements. These actually arrived 2 days after the battle. Joseph, however, had told him distinctly that he was not going to send him any help, and if it had not been for his tactical blunders, Marmont would undoubtedly have caused Wellington to fall back on Portugal. But in 1812, the exigencies of war demanded that France should send forth every soldier, and accordingly in March the Duke of Ragusa was gazetted to the command of the 6th Corps, which was forming in the valley of the Main. On taking up this command, he found that his corps was mainly composed of sailors, drafted from the useless ships, and of recruits, while his artillery had no horses and his cavalry did not exist. With these raw troops, he had to undergo some difficult experiences at Lutzen and Bautzen. But, as the campaign progressed, he molded them into shape, and his divisions did good service in the fighting in Silesia and round Dresden. At the rout after the Battle of Leipzig, Marmont, like most of the higher officers of the army, thought more of his personal safety than of his honor, and allowed himself to be escorted from the field by his staff officers. But in the campaign of 1814, he made amends for all his former blunders, and his fighting record stands high indeed. At Saint-Dizier, La Rothière, Arcis-sur-Aube, Nogent, Cézanne, and Champaubert, he held his own or defeated the enemy with inferior numbers in every case. Once only at Laon did he allow himself to be surprised. When the end came, it was Marmont who, at Joseph's command, had to hand over Paris to the Allies. Thereafter, he was faced with a terrible problem. His army was sick of fighting. Officers and men demanded peace. He had to decide whether his duty to Napoleon was the same as his duty to France. Unfortunately, he acted hurriedly, and without informing the emperor, entered into negotiations with the enemy. The result was far-reaching, for his conduct showed Alexander that the army was sick of war and would no longer fight for Napoleon. It thus cut away the ground of the commissioners, who were trying, by trading on the prestige of the emperor and the fear of his name, to persuade the Tsar to accept Napoleon's abdication on behalf of his son, the King of Rome. The marshal's enemies put down his action to ill will against the emperor for withholding for so long the marshalate and for his treatment after Salamanca. But Marmont asserted that it was patriotism which dictated his action, and further maintained that Napoleon himself ought to have approved of his action, quoting a conversation held in 1813. "If the enemy invaded France," said the emperor, "and seized the heights of Montmartre, you would naturally believe that the safety of your country would command you to leave me, and if you did so, you would be a good Frenchman, a brave man, a conscientious man, but not a man of honor." The defection of the Duke of Ragusa came as a bitter blow to Napoleon. "That Marmont should do such a thing," cried the fallen emperor, "a man with whom I have shared my bread, whom I drew out of obscurity. Ungrateful villain, he will be more unhappy than I." The prophecy was true. The Duke of Ragusa stuck to the Bourbons and refused to join Napoleon during the 100 Days, going to Ghent as chief of the military household of the exiled king. He returned with Louis to Paris and was made Major General of the Royal Guard and a peer of France, in which capacity he sat as one of the judges who condemned Ney to death. But men looked askance at him, and from 1817 he lived in retirement, occupying his leisure in experimental farming, with great injury to his purse, for his elaborate scheme of housing his sheep in 3-storied barns and clothing them in coats made of skin was most unprofitable. Retirement was a bitter blow to the keen soldier, but the Bourbon monarchs clearly understood that the deserter of Napoleon and the judge of Marshal Ney could never be popular with the army. Still, when in July 1830 discontent was seething, Charles X remembered his sterling qualities and summoned him to Paris as governor of the city. It was an unfortunate nomination, for the marshal's unpopularity weakened the bonds of discipline, whilst his eagerness to show his loyalty caused him to adopt such measures as the king ordered, irrespective of their military worth. In vain he warned the king that this was not a revolt, but a revolution. The councils of Polignac were all-powerful. The marshal's political suggestions were unheeded and his military plans overridden. The mass of the troops of the line, kept for long hours without food in the streets, mutinied and went over to the populace, while those who remained loyal and the royal guards, instead of being concentrated and protected by batteries of artillery, were frittered away in useless expeditions into outlying parts of the city. After 2 days' fighting, the royalists had to evacuate the city. Thus it fell to the lot of the marshal once more to hand over Paris to the foes of those to whom his allegiance was due. The Duke of Ragusa accompanied Charles to Cherbourg and quitted France in August 1830, never to return. The remainder of his life was spent in foreign countries. He made Vienna his headquarters, and from there took journeys to Russia, Turkey, Egypt, and Italy. Deeply interested in science and history, he devoted his leisure to writing his memoirs, to works on military science, philanthropy, and travel. Thus occupied, though in exile from his country, he lived a busy, active, and on the whole useful life till death overtook him at Vienna in 1852. Marshal Marmont has been called one of Napoleon's failures, but this criticism is one-sided and unjust. True it is that his name is intimately connected with the failure in Spain and with the fall of the empire, but to judge his career by these two instances and to neglect his other work is to generalize from an insufficient and casual basis. The Duke of Ragusa owed his marshalate, like many others, to his intimacy with Napoleon. But unlike several of the marshals, he really earned his baton. His great powers of organization, so unstintedly given to the rearmament of France and Italy, and his work of regeneration in Dalmatia, together with his military operations in Styria, Spain, and during the campaign of 1814, mark him out as a soldier of great capabilities. Organization was his strong point, but he also possessed great physical bravery and many of the qualities of a commander. His love for his profession was great, and not only had he graduated under Napoleon's eye, but much of his time was spent in studying his calling from a scientific and historical point of view. As a strategist, he probably stood as high as any of his fellow marshals, and his operations in Dalmatia, Spain, and France deserve the careful study of all students of military history. But he failed as a tactician. Salamanca and Laon prove not only that he made mistakes and had not the faculty of retrieving his errors, but above all, he lacked the capacity of seizing on the mistakes of his enemy. In 1811, at El Boden, he had Wellington at his mercy, but he hesitated to strike, for he could not believe his great opponent could make the glaring error of leaving his divisions unsupported. Again and again during his career, he showed that lack of resolution which was responsible for his last catastrophe in Paris, where he allowed his own judgment to be overruled by King Charles's personal desires. In a word, he had the gift of a great quartermaster general rather than of a commander-in-chief. As a man, the marshal's character is an interesting study. In youth, the thirst for personal glory and ambition were the dominant traits, and what stability he had, he drew from his proud sense of honor, which refused to allow him to take plunder or bribes. But responsibility developed many latent qualities. The desire to keep his troops efficient led him to pay a special care to their physical well-being. And from doing this as a duty, he learned to do it as a labor of love. As time went on, desire for personal glory became merged in keen delight in the glory of France, and hence grew up a patriotism which, rightly or wrongly, led to the scenes of 1814 and 1830. Misfortune also had its share in the enlarging of his character. His unhappy marriage, his bitterness at the withholding of the Marshallate, his unpopularity after 1814, led him to remember his father's warning that success is not everything, and turned his attention to the development of those scientific and literary abilities to which he had always shown strong leanings. Hence, though the blight of his marriage and his unpopularity, arising from his desertion of Napoleon, embittered him and caused his memoirs to teem with cutting descriptions of his contemporaries and former friends, his old age, though spent in exile, was soothed by congenial work which proved that to the eye of a general, he united the accomplishments of a scholar and the heart of a philanthropist.
This concludes Chapter 10 of Napoleon's Marshals by R. P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 11 about Louis Suchet. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.